How was Israel to care for the poor among it under the law of Moses? This is the question that we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of Deuteronomy on walking through the Bible. If you have a Bible with you, you can turn to Deuteronomy 24. We're going to be reading from verses 14 to 22. If you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So Deuteronomy 24, beginning at verse 14. You shall not oppress a hired servant who is poor and needy, whether one of your brethren or one of the aliens who is in your land within your gates. Each day you shall give him his wages, and not let the sun go down on it. For he is poor, and has set his heart on it, lest he cry out against you to the Lord, and it be sin to you. Fathers shall not be put to death for their children, nor shall children be put to death for their fathers. A person shall be put to death for his own sin. You shall not pervert justice due the stranger or the fatherless, nor take a widow's garment as a pledge. But you shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and that the Lord your God redeemed you from there. Therefore I command you to do this thing. When you reap your harvest in your field, and forget a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back and get it. It shall be for the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the works of your hands. When you beat your olive trees, you shall not go over the boughs again. It shall be for the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow. When you gather the grapes of your vineyard, you shall not glean it afterwards. It shall be for the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow. And you shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Therefore I command you to do this thing. In this chapter, we've seen God giving out general duties and responsibilities the people had towards another. We've talked about divorce and remarriage, the duties of newly married couples, the collecting of collateral, the dealing with leprosy, and the punishment for kidnapping someone and then harming them. In verses 14 to 22, we find God's tremendous outpouring of love and mercy towards the poor. No matter how great a society is, there will always be poor people. Some are poor because they cannot work through disability. Others are poor because they cannot find a job in a tough labor market. Others are poor because they can't find a job that pays enough wages in order to purchase the things that we need, like food and clothing. Whatever the case, the poor are always present. And it can become very easy for those of us who have wealth being defined as having more than enough to provide for our needs, to look down on the poor and to neglect them, blaming them for the condition that they're in. And while it may be true that there are some poor because they are lazy and wasteful, that is not the case for the vast majority of the poor. And even if someone is lazy, that doesn't mean that we should not help people whom we can help. Now, for someone who is lazy, that might mean helping them find a job, teaching them the importance of work, while at the same time providing for their short-term needs of food. All life is valuable to God, and as Christians, we need to realize that. Just look at how God told Israel to treat the poor among it. No Israelite was to oppress a hired servant, no matter if that servant was a fellow Israelite or a stranger. One way that a person might oppress another is by withholding their wages. We live in a society where most of us are paid twice a month. This pay is for services already rendered. Being paid this way really does hamper those who are poorer among us, for if there is a discrepancy with our pay, or if something goes wrong and we're not paid on time, then those people would really be in trouble, for they wouldn't have savings to fall back on. In Israel, under the law of Moses, people were to be paid daily, as is illustrated in Jesus' parable of the workers of the vineyard found in Matthew 20, verses 1 to 16. Moreover, we find that the people were not to pervert justice against those who were orphans, or take a widow's garment as a pledge. That doesn't mean they could pervert justice to those who weren't such. It just meant that they weren't to take advantage of someone. And the final way that God cared for the poor, as found here in Deuteronomy 24, was through the provision of food. We've already seen in Deuteronomy 23 that a person who walked through a field could eat from it, but couldn't take extra from it. And we saw in Leviticus 19, 9 and 10 that Israel was to leave some of its harvest behind for the poor. But here in Deuteronomy 24, we have God going a little further by commanding those who harvested that if they forgot a sheaf in the field, don't go back and get it. It would be there for the poor orphan or widow. When olives were pressed, the harvester was not to go back a second time to collect the leftovers. The same could be said of grapes. God's mercy on the poor is seen throughout Scripture, but it was also to remind them that God protected and provided for them while they were poorer in Egypt. May we do likewise today. We skip verse 16 on the way through so as to keep the thoughts about the poor together, but here we find that the Father was not to be put to death for the sins of the Son, neither was the Son to be put to death for the sins of the Father. Each would die for their own sins. This passage seems to be at odds with some other passages where an entire family was punished for the sins of one, like with the household of Korah in Numbers 16. What we need to realize is that God was the one to direct that entire household to be punished. God knows the hearts of all and thus can make proper judgments, for he knew all who sinned in the matter. In reality, God does not punish the righteous with the wicked, in that he holds them accountable for the sins of others. So what we can learn from these passages is that when God commanded that an entire household be killed, these households were complicit in the sins committed. However, when it comes to statutes and judgments in Deuteronomy, they would be executed by men, not necessarily under the direction of God. Therefore, since they didn't know the hearts of men, they were only to inflict judgment on the one who sinned, and leave to God to judge if others were complicit or not. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of Deuteronomy 25, verses 1 to 10, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time.
Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.